Hi everybody, I'm Jesse from ShrinkRC.com. We make body mounts and scale accessories for hardbody, trail trucks, and rock crawlers. I just finished this latest build and I'm going to do a breakdown on it for you to show you everything I had to do to build this truck. This is an RC four-wheel drive XtraCab hardbody that I've put on the new Redcat Ascent chassis. So let me tell you a little bit about this build. This body comes pre-painted from RC4WD drive. Lately I haven't seemed to be enjoying much painting, and I've been having friends paint trucks for me or buying pre-painted trucks, and I gotta say that I'm enjoying that. Painting is kind of my least favorite part of the hobby. I like tinkering with stuff and messing with the suspension and all the other stuff with the trucks and figuring out how it's all put together. But man, I hate sanding and painting. So it worked out for me great that this body comes pre-painted like this. I'm going to start from the outside of this body and work my way in so I can show you everything I had to do to make this build work. One thing you'll notice is that these are not the wheels and tires that come on the Redcat Ascent. In fact, these wheels and tires were some tires that I was using just for testing purposes to check the wheel placement in the wheel wells and things like that, and they really kind of grew on me, and I decided that I'm just going to leave them on there. These tires happen to be from G-Made, and they are a 4.19 size tire, and it looks like that's a 1.9 size wheel on there, and they just really fit this build well to me. So here's what this looks like from all the different sides, and you can see I have not cut the fender wells on here, and that's something I don't like to do unless I have to. I like to keep the bodies kind of looking like you would see them in real life, and of course in real life sometimes you do cut the fenders, but in this case I wanted to keep it as close to stock as possible. I don't have a back bumper on here. I might add one to it later, but the fender well here is going to work with this 4.19. Let me show you the full compression on the shocks. These shocks don't have a lot of travel to them on the Redcat Ascent, and that's actually okay with me. You know, when I got into rock crawling in the beginning, I thought that you wanted to have shocks that moved as much as possible so your axle could twist as much as possible and be as loose as possible, and that can actually create problems of its own. And it turns out that you don't want to just have as much slop as possible in your suspension, and sometimes having not a ton of travel can help prevent you from flipping over, because sometimes when you're crawling, if you have too much of a slop in your suspension and too much droop in it, you can have a wheel or a tire fall down into a crevice and get stuck in there. And sometimes having a little bit less travel can prevent that from happening, because you'll kind of glide over cracks instead of falling down into them, if that makes any sense. I'm going to show you once I take the body off how I've actually got the rear shocks oriented a little bit more vertically than the front shocks, and I'm doing that so that it requires a little bit more force to get the rear to flex. At some point in my playing with RC trucks, it occurred to me, and from reading online, it wasn't my idea, but I stumbled upon an article where somebody was talking about the fact that you want to have the rear be stiffer than the front, and they explained why, and when I read all about that, it made sense to me. I'm not going to explain to you all the reasoning behind it, but that has worked for me, and that's always how I try to set up my trucks, to where the back has, if there's tension adjustments on the spring, I'll put more tension on the rear springs than I do on the front. But another way you can affect that is by the actual lean angle of your shocks. If you have the shock leaned very far, it'll be easier to flex, and if you have it more vertical, it'll be more difficult to flex. So I've got the rear shocks oriented a little bit more vertically than the front shocks on this, and I had to do a couple of tricks to make that work. But as I mentioned, we're going to start from the outside and work our way in. So I already showed you the 4.19 tires that are on here. There's not a lot of other external modifications to this body, because like I say, I did not trim the fender wells, and that's something I have done before. In fact, I don't know if you can see this on here. This is my Vanquish VS410, and I've got 4.19s on it too. The body's sitting a little bit lower on it, and I wound up trimming about 5 millimeters off of this whole opening in here, and that's about the max that I like to trim off, because you start doing much more than that like this and it starts to look pretty crazy, and you wind up having to cut the grill out and things like that. This is also a Vanquish. That's a Vanquish VRD, and we're going to talk about that soon in another video. I just need to get that painted. The other modification I did have to make on this body is I had to cut holes for the shock towers here. Now you don't have to do that. You can switch to a cantilever setup, or you can get shock towers that shorter shock towers that go way forward and lean the shock over, but I already told you I didn't want to do that. I wanted these shocks to be kind of vertical. So this is something I do to very many of my trucks. I go ahead and I cut out a little opening for the shock towers in the back. Now you can hide this. What you can do is get yourself some ice chests or some other kind of boxes, or portable welder or whatever, and you can cut out underneath it, make a hollow in it, and then you can set that down over your shock tower, and then it looks like you haven't cut a hole in there. And I might do that on here, but it doesn't really bother me. This reminds me of, when I was a kid, I'd see trucks that were highly modified and they had extra long reservoir shocks in the back, and they would purposely punch holes through the bed and put bracing on there and have the shock run up real tall like that. It kind of reminds me of that in a good way. So I don't mind doing that. The other thing you can see, and I'm going to show you more of this in a minute when I take off the body, is I trimmed these shock towers. The shock towers from the Redcat Ascent are really big. They're really long, and I didn't want to cut a giant hole in the bed, so I actually trimmed the shock tower so that I only had to make a pretty small hole around it here and here. I'm looking to see if there's anything else I wanted to show you on this body before I take the body off, but let me just give you a good look at the truck and how it all sits on there. I want to show you here's the movement in the, you can see these tires are going to clear. They're going to rub just a tiny bit right there, and a little bit of rubbing is okay. But I'm not going to trim that body any more than that. These XtraCab bodies are real heavy. They're one of the heavier bodies that you can put on these. These doors are still opening and closing. Let's see, can I get in there? You can see the doors opening and closing and working correctly. Here's the skirt that's on the side of the interior. We're going to talk about this skirt on the side of the interior in a minute. When I take the body off, I want to tell you something about it. Let's take this body off of here. This is a cheapy little 4-volt screwdriver I got. I got this one on Amazon. It's like 35 bucks. I like using 4-volt screwdrivers like this because instead of using a drill, you can actually feel this thing and feel how it's torquing on you when you tighten things, so that you don't over tighten. It'll give you a little bit of more responsive feedback when you're tightening it than a drill will. With a drill, you can just go on there and crank it up, and with these little M3 screws, you can wind up stripping things, and nobody wants to do that. So I really like the way these work. This isn't available right now on Amazon, or I'd tell you about it more. It's called a Bresson, but they come and go off Amazon, but if you can find one on there, get it. Pop the body off. Now, remember I mentioned I wanted to talk to you about the skirt on this interior. On all of our XtraCabs, that includes this one, really any of the XtraCabs that you use ShrinkRC body mounts with, on the XtraCab they made this skirt here really long, and it comes all the way down to where it gets near these holes where the body mounts go. And well, not this one back here, but this one up here. But this skirt will go down so far that it actually crashes into the top of this body mount before you're able to get the body all the way down. And it's got an interference of just about 2 millimeters. So I take out that interior, and I get out my Dremel tool, and I mark it, and I go in and I grind off 2 millimeters just from the edge of this skirt all the way down this side and all the way down this side. And that gives you enough room to drop it down. I wanted to point that out because what I also wanted to say is that other than that, there's no trimming required on this interior to fit it on this chassis. And that's something that's unique. I think on most of the applications that we make body mounts for, you usually wind up having to do some trimming up in here to clear your transmission and clear your motor. And that's on the XtraCab. It's different on Mojave 4-doors. Mojave 4-doors have a real high floor in them, and they actually clear a lot of stuff without much trimming. But the XtraCab has kind of a low floor in it, and that means that if you're building something like a Vanquish, you actually have to trim out a whole section through the tunnel here to clear the motor. I'm talking about the Vanquish VS410, like the Phoenix and the Fordyce. And you have to go in and you have to clear out a section along there to fit the transmission and the motor. And in this case, you do not have to do any trimming like that to the interior, because the way the Redcat comes, the motor sits real low here and the transmission sits even lower. And that's something that's really cool about the way they did this. The other thing I wanted to point out, though, is I did trim. I would call this, like, what is that, a bulkhead? I trimmed this a little bit, or a firewall. In a car, it'd be kind of a firewall. That I trimmed a little bit of this section of the firewall here and here to clear this part of the shock tower right here and here. I think it was going to hit somewhere along this slope on the shock tower. So I did go in and trim the firewall right here to make room for those shock towers. So this body is, a lot of times on these builds, you wind up having to cut a lot of little different spots on the body to get everything to fit. You got to cut for the motor, cut for the transmission, cut for the... But on this one, I just trimmed right here. I trimmed a little bit off the side skirt here for the body mounts, and I made these 2 holes for the shock towers. That's all the modifications I've made on this body. So it's pretty cool. I actually hardly had to do any work, especially since I didn't paint it either. Now let's get into the chassis and the body mounts here. Here you can see our body mounts. And I've actually just dropped these for the XtraCab and the Mojave 4-door and the Mojave 2-door. And I'll be making them for a couple of the other rigs as well. Probably the Chevy Scottsdale. And I'm not sure what we'll do after that, but for sure the Scottsdale. And I'll have to think about what other bodies we wanna make these for. If you're making one of these with the Mojave 2-door and you're going to run a bed, you're going to have to make custom links in the back to get the wheelbase shorter. I tried seeing if there was some off-the-shelf options for the rear links to get them shorter like that, and I really couldn't find anything that worked great. We have a video that you can find in our library that is how to make custom short links, and those were for a Traxxas TRX4 in that video. In fact, that one had this body on it. But if you find that video, you'll learn how to make custom rear links, and you can make short links, long links, anything you want. And that's a good video resource for you to make custom links. Here's a body mount. You can see that I've got holes provided on the XtraCab body mounts and on the Mojave 4-door to where you can use axial SCX 10.2 and 10.3 style rock sliders on here. These happen to be SSD RC Trail King rock sliders that I've got mounted up on here. The other thing about our body mounts is they come with, for this model, not all of our body mounts, but our Redcat Ascent body mounts for the XtraCab and the Mojave 4-door and the Mojave 2-door come with an actual spot on here for you to put your battery strap, which is a nice feature to have on there. You can see that I put the speed controller over here on this side, and I'm doing that because I'm running a 2200 milliamp hour battery over here. When you put that battery on here, you need to scoot it back a little bit to right around where I've got an L and R on these mounts so you know which side they go on, but right around where that letter is where you want to stop your battery, because the floor of the XtraCab dips down like this and goes like that in the footwell, and you got to set it back like this so it's more under the seat a little bit, and I'm just pointing that out, but you'll figure that out on your own. So the battery winds up sitting from around here to around here, and that fits otherwise under that cab just fine. But since I'm running the battery on this side, I wanted to do a little bit of weight distribution, so I pulled the speed controller from over here and I set it over here. That's not something you have to do. You can leave the speed controller where it was if you want to. And I did wind up putting my receiver up here because I had a good space for it. So I took the receiver and stuck it up there, put the speed controller over here. I was talking about the rear shock towers. I did 2 things on these rear shock towers. For one thing, you can see this shiny section here. That's where I trimmed off. The front towers and the rear towers are the same, I think. And if you see this little bar here, you can't do this on the front because there's your motor mount. But I trimmed that little gusset off. And when I trimmed that gusset off, sanded it up a little bit, that gave me a much narrower shock tower to run up through the body. And I don't think that's going to affect its stiffness at all. That would have affected its front to back stiffness, and you know, these aren't going anywhere. One thing I did do though for the frame overall stiffness is I left this cross brace in here. You can see how you take off the stock rock sliders, or the stock side plates to put on our body mounts. Those go through the same holes, use the factory screws. Then in the back, you're going to take everything off of the back. You could run a bumper under here, but it's going to be pretty far back from the end of the bed. So I took that bumper off. I may put the stock bumper that goes on there. I might just leave it like that. Now that I think about it, I think I'll leave it like that for maximum clearance. You leave this cross brace on here, drop the rear bed mount on here, put the provided screws that we give you in here, and set the bed down on here. Then you can drill 2 holes through the bed, and we've got some bed support on here too, so that you're not getting a rocking motion on the body, and your mounts in the body will last longer. So what else did I want to show you on this? Oh, and I flipped these shock towers. They're actually backwards from how they were. These were all the way up here, and I wound up flipping them around to get these shocks in a nice vertical position. They were way leaned forward. In fact, they were leaned forward more than stock, because in the back here, look at these rod ends. If you notice, these rod ends here are pretty short and these ones are pretty long. Well, this chassis comes with all rod ends that are this long, and that means the wheelbase on this thing is about 12.3 on the money. The problem is that body that's advertised as 12.3, the wheel wells are longer than 12.3. Ask me how I know. So the wheel wells on that body are more like 12.5, somewhere in that range. And so what I did is, on these rear links, I bought myself some RC 4-wheel drive long rod ends to put on here, and I'll put a link to that. And those extended the rear of this to line up just about right with the rear holes, the rear wheel wells. The other thing I had to do is get myself an axial drive shaft back here. I was able to use the Redcat cups on the ends, so I didn't have to buy new cups. But this section of the drive shaft, and I'll put that part number in there too, this is all from Axial, and it fits on the Redcat Ascent cups. So these are longer. This is the Wild Boar HD rear drive shaft. It's meant for a 12.3 inch wheelbase. It actually winds up working out just right on this one. If you try to just extend these rods back here and not replace that drive shaft, the drive shaft is probably going to fall out on you when you're on the trail, and nobody wants that. I think I saw some other people talking about this. These front links showed up, and they were oriented to where they went out and then in, and that's not right. So I went and took them and made them to where they curve the right way to clear obstacles. But there's not any other modifications that I did to this chassis. So I extended the rear drive shaft, I extended the rear links with some RC 4-wheel drive long rod ends, I trimmed the shock towers so that they would be smaller going through the bed there, and I flipped them so that I could run these rear shock towers a little bit more vertically. I hear that this thing comes with a good servo up front, and now that I've gone down to an even smaller tire than the factory size, I'm expecting this servo to be plenty. We'll see how I feel about the motor after a while. I'm going to go ahead and run it with the stock setup. If I don't like it, I'll wind up switching it over to a Fusion system. And I've got some other videos where I talk about the Fusion. I'm a big fan. We've got XtraCab body mounts for a lot of chassis. I just wanted to mention that. We've got them for the Vanquish VS410, Axial SCX102, Element Enduro. What else do we have them for? We have them for the TF2, and there's a lot of options. I think we've got 10 different chassis that we offer XtraCab body mounts for. The next one I'm going to work on is the Vanquish VRD. If you have any questions, please put them below and I will answer you as quickly as I can. And these are our new mounts for the XtraCab on the Redcat Ascent. Thank you guys for watching. Peace.